Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the review and recap series for the Living Under Nazi Rule topic. In the previous videos, we've looked at the establishment of the dictatorship, which is theme 1 in the first video. And in the last 2 videos, we've been on theme 2, which is about control and opposition between 1933 and 1939. This is the last video lesson on control and opposition, and we're looking at what opposition was there to the Nazis between 1933 and 1939. We've looked at how the Nazis used terror and propaganda to control the people of Germany, but there were still individuals and groups of people who tried to oppose and resist the Nazis between these years. Now, it's really important that you look at the years very closely. We're stopping at 1939 here for this theme, because when you come to do Germany in War, which is theme 4, between 1939 and 1945, you will see some similar and some different opposition groups. So make sure that you don't get these mixed up. So, the opposition to the Nazis between these years can be roughly split up into 3 different categories. The first of these categories is opposition that came from young people in Germany, from the youth. You had different groups of youth organisations that opposed the Nazis, and the first of these was the Young Communists. Now, Communists, as we obviously know, were a different political party in opposition to the Nazis, and they had their own youth group that would meet secretly, and they would dress in anti-Nazi styles. They would wear sort of bright red checkered shirts that were very different from the Hitler Youth outfits, and they would often gather to write anti-Nazi leaflets and disseminate these in communities. Another group who opposed the Nazis was young Christians. So we're going to look at religious opposition in a separate sort of theme in a few minutes' time. But young Christians were hugely influential because there were 2.5 million young Christians in Germany. Their meetings were banned by the Nazis, but they still continued to go on illegal pilgrimages and sort of condemn the Nazi racial policy on these journeys. Another young movement that opposed the Nazis was the Edelweiss Pirates. Now, they are called the Edelweiss Pirates because they wear a white Edelweiss flower on their lapels, on their clothes. And they're formed in a place called the Rhine-Ruhr region, which is in sort of Western Germany, in 1938. They come from a very working class background, so they're sort of not as well off as other parts of German society, but they still continued to oppose the Nazis by organising camps. They would listen to the radio, so foreign radio stations. They would play songs that were condemned by the Nazis. And they also wrote anti-Nazi leaflets and graffitied anti-Nazi slogans on walls. The Edelweiss Pirates were quite problematic for the Nazis because some members of this group even picked fights with members of the Hitler Youth. And as a result of this, they were taken very seriously by the Nazi regime, and it did mean that some of their members were publicly hanged, despite the fact that they were children in the eyes of the law. Okay, so it shows the extent to which the Nazis considered them a problem and were willing to deal with them. You also get another group of young people called swing kids. Now, swing is a type of music. It's a type of jazz music, which at the time would have predominantly been made by African Americans. This, of course, went against Hitler's racial theory and against his promotion of Germanic culture. So African American music and jazz music was condemned and banned. So this is what they gathered to listen to. They had very long hair, so they were going against the Nazi style for appearance. They wore wide trousers. And again, the Nazis consider them that dangerous to their rule that Himmler, who is the head of the SS, as you can remember, sets up a special unit within the Gestapo to target them specifically. And again, the swing kids are arrested and sent to camps, concentration camps. So again, you can see just how seriously the Nazis were taking them. So that's opposition from the youth. You also get opposition during this time from what is known as the left. Now, when I say the left, I mean the left of what is known as a political spectrum. So, when you think of a rainbow, that has a spectrum of colours. You've got different shades of colours that sort of, some are very different from others, but gradually they get more and more different. It's the same with a political spectrum, and you can see on the board there that I've drawn a line kind of showing you the political spectrum in Germany in 1933 and 1939. On the far right, you have the Nazis. So on the far right of this political spectrum, you have the Nazi Party. On the far left, you have the communists. So you can see here that they're naturally opposed to one another in their political beliefs. You don't need to worry too much into what it means to be on the left and what it means to be on the right. We already know the Nazi ideology from theme 1 in the establishment of the dictatorship video. To be on the extreme left means to be an extreme socialist, okay? And it's a different form of political rule. In the middle, you can see that we have what is known as the centre. So if you are in the centre, you are kind of not too far on the right, you're not too far on the left, you're in the middle. There is also something called centre-left, and that is a group called the Social Democrats in Germany in 1933. So these groups on the left, so you can see here the communists and on the far left and the Social Democrats on the centre-left oppose the Nazi rule. So let's start off with the Social Democrats then on the centre-left. Well, as you can remember from theme 1, most of their leaders flee in 1933. Don't forget, in July 1933, Hitler bans the creation of new political parties, and he makes it illegal to be a member of the Social Democrats because he claims that they are corrupt. So most of their leaders are either arrested or they flee and go into hiding, and that just leaves small resistance groups, for example, like the one in Hanover, that only has 250 members. So they're quite a small group, but they do continue to try and resist Nazi rule. How did they try and do this? Well, they targeted industrial areas, so where workers were, where factories were, because this is where the power lay in Germany in the 1930s, because the workers were the largest class in Germany at the time, and they controlled all of the production. So if you can control the production, you can control what Germany does. What would they do in these areas? Well, they wrote anti-Nazi leaflets, they produced anti-Nazi posters, and again, the Gestapo took them very seriously. They managed to arrest around 1,200 of them during this time. But the biggest problem that the SD face, the Social Democrats face, is that they don't combine forces with the communists on the extreme left. The communists and the Social Democrats hate each other pretty much as they do the Nazis. So they don't work together, which means that the Nazis are able to pick off the Social Democrats because they're the smaller group. If we look at the resistance from the communists then, who were on the extreme left over here, they are much more active than the Social Democrats because of their beliefs. They're far more willing to go to extreme measures to resist the Nazis. They visibly resisted the Nazis by having meetings, by producing newsletters, propaganda, but because they were so visible in their resistance, it meant that they were easily targeted and arrested by the Gestapo. They produced something called the Red Flag, which was a monthly sort of newspaper type thing, and they published 10,000 copies of this a month. Okay, so they were able to pump out lots and lots of anti-Nazi propaganda and distribute this in industrial areas. And an example of how far the communists were willing to go to resist the Nazi rule during this time is best epitomised by a man called Georg Esler, who was a trade unionist. If you remember, trade unions are also banned in the summer of 1933, but he's also a communist. And he is that willing to resist Nazi rule that he tries to bomb Hitler in 1939. He tries to assassinate him. Unfortunately for him, this doesn't happen. Okay, it fails. The bomb misses Hitler. And he's then caught, imprisoned at Dachau concentration camp for 5 years before being executed. So you can see at the bottom there's a quote from a historian called Richard J. Evans, and he says, of all the groups who held out against Nazism in the early years of the Third Reich, that's the Nazi rule, the communists were the most persistent and the most undaunted. They paid the greatest price as a consequence. So the historian there is saying that the communists were the biggest threat to the Nazis in terms of opposition because they were so willing to publicly resist them. And they didn't seem to be fazed by attempts to try and stop them. But as a result of their open resistance, they were so easily targeted, arrested, and sent to camps, and in some cases executed. Okay, so when we say opposition from the left, we mean the political left, and that includes the Social Democrats and the Communists. The third category of opposition that we can look at then for theme 2 comes from the church or from religious opponents. Just to give you a bit of background on the religious sort of aspect of Germany in 1933, between 1933 and 39, a large percentage of Germany was religious. There were roughly about 22 million Catholics and 40 million Protestants at this time. That is a huge portion of Germany's population. Hitler realised that he was going to have to do something with them because if they sort of banded together, they posed a significant threat. There were far more religious members of the church than there were Nazi members. So, in July 1933, in the first few months of Hitler's rule as Chancellor, Hitler and Pope Pius, who's the leader of the Catholic Church, sign what is known as the Concordat. And the Concordat is basically an agreement. the Pope promises not to interfere politically with Germany, and in return, Hitler promises to protect churches in Germany, not to attack them in any way. But, of course, Hitler chooses to renege on this agreement, and Hitler closes all church schools and arrests priests. So this agreement falls apart very quickly because the Nazis go against it. So, what else does he do? Well, he creates, for Protestants, what is known as a Reich church. That basically means a Nazi church or a government church. And it was set up, and pastors basically had to sign an oath swearing loyalty to Hitler. So again, this shows that all promises of non-interference were broken. And that Reich church is to try and control what is being said in churches and what the pastors are preaching about in their sermons. But you get lots of religious opponents to the Nazis during this time. The first is Cardinal Galen, who is a Catholic bishop in Germany. He preaches against the Nazis' racial policy, and he speaks out against the Nazis' T4 program against people with disabilities, where they were sterilizing and euthanizing or murdering people with disabilities. Cardinal Galen is too high profile, so this makes him a very powerful opponent because the Nazis can't do a great deal about him. They can only target his churches, they can't really target him. You also get Martin Niemöller, who is a Protestant pastor. Originally, Martin Niemöller is in support of Hitler and the Nazis, but as the 1930s progresses, he realizes that this is wrong. So he starts a non-Nazi church called the Confessional Church that is in opposition to the Reich Church that I mentioned here. 6,000 pastors join his confessional church, leaving only 3,000 pastors in Germany in the Reich Church. So it's far more popular. He starts a far more popular non-Nazi church than the Reich churches, and that sends alarm bells to the Nazi leadership because they've got far more religious leaders joining the non-Nazi church than the Nazi one. What does he do in these churches? Well, he preached against Nazi racial policy, saying that it was wrong in the eyes of God. And as a result, he's sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp and then to Dachau concentration camp, but he manages to survive the ordeal. You've got Pope Pius XI. Obviously, we talked about him here. He signs the Concordat in July 1933. But as the 1930s progresses and he sees what's happening to Germany, again, he realizes this is wrong. So Pope Pius writes a letter which condemned the Nazis very strongly. That letter is called With Burning Anxiety, and he manages to smuggle it into churches in Germany. This letter is then read out in churches, and as a result, the Gestapo try and confiscate them and destroy the letters, and they target churches that read this out. You've also got Paul Schneider, who is a Protestant pastor. He joins Martin Niemöller's non-Nazi confessional church, and he preaches again against Nazi racial policies. He's arrested in 1934, released, and he carries on resisting the Nazis, so he's arrested again in 1935. He actively banned Nazis from his sermons. He would not let Nazi party members into his sermons and into his church. And as a result, he's sent to Buchenwald concentration camp, and he is the first religious opponent that we know of to be murdered by the Nazis, because he is murdered by lethal injection at Buchenwald camp. You also get another group of religious opponents, the Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany at the time. The reason that they oppose the Nazis is because they are pacifists, so they don't believe in violence. They write anti-Nazi leaflets, and as a result, 6,000 of them are imprisoned. Again, the Nazis take their resistance very seriously, and they set up special groups to deal with the Jehovah's Witnesses. So in summary then, this is the different categories of opposition to the Nazis between 1933 and 1939. Just as in the previous videos, I've got a selection of questions that are going to flash up on the screen in a second. I'm going to put the questions up now. So you can see that there are 10 questions in total this time, a few more. What I would like to do is pause the video now. Because in a few seconds' time, I'm going to show you the answers to these questions. So if you want to write them down and practice, feel free to do so. Thank you for watching this video. The answers are going to appear now.